we're really trying to break that down because we do believe fundamentally that cannabinoids will have a massive impact on the health of people. But you got to hit these things so you can build the consumer trust and confidence and get these products into the channels that, the average person has access to, not just dispensaries, because that's a limited channel for sure.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Alleh Lindquist, CEO of FloraWorks. Alleh, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Excited to dive in. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Really excited to talk to Alleh and dive into a really hot topic in terms of making cannabinoids medicinally beneficial and the steps that are required. FloraWorks has been participating in, and I'm even more excited because it's nice to have West Coaster back on the pod again, finally. How are you, Brian?
Yeah, I'm doing good. And yeah, that is true. We got another West Coaster, but I think it's important to talk about CBN today, all the benefits it has, and actually the importance behind the scientific claims here. And being the non-scientist in the room, I'm looking forward to having this kind of simplified for me so everyone listening can really understand what is true and what is not true. So I guess before we dive in, can you give a little background about yourself and kind of how you found your way to the cannabinoid space?
Yeah, so a pretty interesting kind of background story. I started as a commercial advertising photographer in my 20s and was shooting global ad campaigns in the sports lifestyle space. I actually was on a shoot for a yoga shoot for a magazine, and I met somebody who was growing cannabis under the medical marijuana system here in Oregon. And always, was a consumer and just thought that was really interesting and decided to dive in, built some grow operations, and then ended up getting into extraction very early in the days when there were just the first machines. We were building them, designing them. Ended up getting the first recreational extraction license here in the state of Oregon. Built up a company, a couple brands, vape pens, dabbable products. Learned a lot about kind of that foundational cannabinoid extraction, distillation work, and then ended up exiting that company in 2019. And through that process, had come across some scientists and expanded my view of the potential of rare cannabinoids, even novel cannabinoids that haven't been created yet. And started working on a project founded FloraWorks basically to find a pathway for manufacturing CBN at scale and bring it to market. It wasn't available at the time. And we did that, within our first year, built a process and went out to some folks that I know in the industry, particularly Groon and Wild, who are, some of the larger, more substantial edible companies out there, and said, hey, there's an old anecdote here that old weed causes a more drowsy or kind of sedative effect, sleepy effect due to the oxidation of THC in the CBN. And we built a process to basically do this at scale. And we think there could be a great product line here. They bought into it, launched those products, and now CBN SKUs are 4 of the top 5 selling SKUs across the nation in dispensaries. And so that was kind of the entry point for FloraWorks to start thinking about and exploring the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids and where that would go and how we see that kind of changing the landscape here.
So totally makes sense from us how we got to this standpoint, but there must have been a conversation internally. Do we want to take this path or should we just continue on? So what happened internally to explore cannabinoid clinical trials and to think that this was the current path that we both should take?
Yeah, so just obviously being in this industry, always at the forefront of where regulation's going, what is it going to look like in the future? What would a mature industry kind of land on down the road? And it's a messy space, right? You've got federal and state differences. You've got hemp versus cannabis. You've got just a lot of complexity around where the FDA sits on these things and DEA. So basically, when we saw that this was working, people were buying this product, they wanted CBN. That was the confidence to say, this could be a true sleep aid product out there. And, what's the pathway to go down? What would be the regulatory framework that you need to do to get a dietary ingredient standing and be able to take this from dispensaries or, the hemp markets, as I'll kind of just refer to them. And we can get into that a little bit, but to say, how would Kirkland's signature, what are the requirements there? What's the FDA requirements to be able to make a claim? And we just, dug in on that and started down the process, basically.
And so by kind of taking that initiative, you guys are essentially kind of paving the road for, if you're successful, for anyone else that wants to use CBN as an ingredient. They're going to be utilizing a lot of the work that you guys are doing right now to be able to make those claims that it is an ingredient. And so what was kind of the conversation like internally when you're like, hey, we're going to have to spend money to kind of carry this task up this hill, and a lot of other people aren't going to have to kind of climb that same hill? Was that a conversation internally?
Yeah, so it actually isn't that way. And these claims and this work is for FloraWorks only. So because this, isn't a natural or it's a natural compound, but we use a process to make it that is proprietary. We even have a patent on the process that we manufacture CBN with. But we trademark the ingredient under True CBN, which is a similar process that traditional supplement ingredient suppliers will do for their work. So the studies for sleep are done on True CBN, even though it is an identical compound. It is CBN. There's an aspect of an impurity profile that's been all cleaned up, and we know exactly what that looks like. So we know it's pure there. And the toxicology work as well that leads to the dietary ingredient filing. All of that is done on FloraWorks CBN or True CBN, and therefore we are now looking at licensing that as an active ingredient to make those claims and meet those safety standards, so that it's not for everyone. Yeah, so that's an important business decision. I think that's why it hasn't been done, or this is just a hard approach. Is maybe it hasn't been seen that way, right, in the past, that you could do that process, but fortunately, we had some good insight from traditional nutraceutical and supplement companies. Great example was KSM-66, which is an ashwagandha company out of India. They call their ashwagandha KSM-66. They are the dominant supplier of that globally. And it actually says KSM-66, not ashwagandha, as the active ingredient. And they've run a bunch of studies. So all the claims around ashwagandha are really tied to their proprietary ingredient. So we've taken a similar approach here at FloraWorks. Otherwise, it would be really difficult, particularly to convince investors to invest in this work when we couldn't own it and we'd just be doing the work for everybody.
I think that's an important distinction, right? Because I think people see CBN on the products they buy, and there might be claims because sometimes people, let's call it, bend the rules in the gray area sometimes. But I think what your team has done has really signified a distinctive difference. That our product here has claims behind it that has been validated by science, which is separate than some of the other claims which have just been validated by make-believe, correct?
Anecdote, yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think that's fine, I guess, in a sense. Obviously, the FDA could step in. They're more interested in more egregious claims than sleep maybe. But the real thing here is, what would it take for a Nature's Made or a Life Extension or a Kirkland Signature or a GNC Vitamin Shop or Target, for example, to actually say, yeah, we're willing to accept this product, one, as an ingredient into our product listing, or as a retailer like Target to say, yeah, we're comfortable having this sit on our shelves. And, they're not going to have products that say sleep on the front unless there's a legitimate study backing that claim that makes it, safe, because, there's liability that could come with those things as well. And the same thing goes particularly for dietary ingredient standing or the toxicology work behind this, is that today no cannabinoid has been approved for human consumption. So the Farm Bill legalized hemp, which essentially legalized cannabinoids, but it didn't approve it for it to be consumed in a product or as a food ingredient or as a supplement. And CBD has a wildly interesting nexus where it was approved as Epidiolex, which is an epilepsy drug, which was, the whole Charlotte's Web story, kind of led out of the research that went into Epidiolex. But that was approved before the 2018 Farm Bill. And so there's a rule at the FDA that something that is approved as a drug cannot go backwards and become a supplement. And so essentially all CBD being sold across the market is being sold off label as an epilepsy drug. without the regulations of the drug industry. So there's no legitimate legal framework for the sale of CBD in the US today, which is, obviously it's an industry, but it's also capped at a certain point here, right? Where adoption is slowed down. You can't go into mainstream channels. Mainstream consumers don't accept this stuff yet. And so we're really trying to break that down because we do believe fundamentally that cannabinoids will have a massive impact on the health of people. But you got to hit these things so you can build the consumer trust and confidence and get these products into the channels that, the average person has access to, not just dispensaries, because that's a limited channel for sure.
So we just talked about a lot of different cannabinoids. Why did FloraWorks choose to pursue CBN?
I think it was a little bit of luck in that of just, the chemist here had a vision for CBN before the company started. It was just a project of interest. The little bit around the anecdotal, like I said, around old cannabis having, oxidized THC that turns into CBN, that potentially was an effect there. So, we could have chosen maybe CBC or THCV or something else to have gone after, but CBN just felt like the right one. And it turned out to be the best performing rare cannabinoid or minor cannabinoid to date. And, with our study confirming in a double-blind placebo-controlled study that it actually is effective as a pure compound for sleep, that we made the right choice. So a little bit of luck and a little bit of foresight, maybe.
That chemist knew exactly where he was targeting.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about that double-blinded placebo-controlled study. What needs to happen prior to starting that? And then what is the first step? For those who are unfamiliar with the whole concept, can you just kind of break down what needs to happen internally to then say, okay, this is what we need to do. These are the steps that need to be laid out.
Yeah. So there's companies out there that do this. We use a company called Radical Sciences that it's essentially, wants to democratize research for supplements to build valid claims. And so, we came to them and said, we think CBN could be effective for sleep. We've been recording, data or anecdote back from customers around, different dosages that might be interesting. We've got people that have been consuming this for a year when keeping sleep journals. And we'd like to test 3 different dosages. So we did 25, 50, and 100 milligrams. But the difference here is that, most of the products out there today have other cannabinoids in them, primarily THC with CBN. So we aren't a THC company, and we want this product, the goal was to see it in mainstream channels outside of dispensaries. So no THC. And what we really saw is that 25 and 50 was more in the range of what we were hearing back from people saying was effective. And there were a few people, particularly with, maybe more aggressive sleep issues, that were taking as much as 100 milligrams. So we put that study together around those dosages, essentially to kind of be able to make a valid claim here. The big piece is that it's double blinded, so nobody knows what they're taking. And there's a placebo, something that doesn't have any CBN in it in the study, and that the study is actually written to correct scientific standards and is IRB registered, which is a registration for a study that allows you to publish it, that kind of validates it. So, and then there's the important piece, particularly because this is still survey-based study, that it has a large enough cohort of individuals participating that you have statistical capability to zero in and say, these are the statistical outcomes of these reported effects. And so all of those were met in this study. We even actually included melatonin in the study to basically say, our real competitor in the market in sleep aid is melatonin, which, is starting to have some different side effects that people are reporting. It's a hormone. And so when you start to take hormones, you're changing brain chemistry. And so there's different issues that have come from that. But we ran the largest study on melatonin in history as well in this case. And CBN at 50 milligrams outperformed melatonin, which was really great to see. Another thing that was, really interesting here is that 100 milligrams had no improvement over 50. So essentially, you have a saturation or some aspect there where you don't need to take any more than that, which I think is also important in terms of just consumer trust here. is that, we're not just trying to give you as much of the stuff as we possibly can. We found an optimal dose. There was an increase in effect from 25 to 50, and then there was no improvement from there on. So just really, really interesting pieces of data there. That was actually novel as well from a concept of dosage. And we filed a patent on those dose ranges for CBN for the treatment of sleep disorders as well. So again, more intellectual property that we're capturing around this. And the science gives you the ability to do that.
So how do we break down man versus woman, weight, age, all those concepts? How does that put together? And then secondary question, how do you ensure that the self-reporting data is clean? And by clean, I mean, how do you know that a person who said they slept really good didn't have 10 drinks that same night? Were they not allowed to take certain activities? How do you work in order to make sure that you're getting accurate data?
Yeah, so the study itself is an already accepted sleep study out there. So it's developed, it's been around. You could run this study in other places than Radical. It's called Promise 8. The recruitment is really where a lot of that takes place for what you're talking about. And they're always trying to recruit a wide diversity of ethnicities, weights, gender into that study to give you at least as much of an average. Because again, this is statistical outcomes. And then there are questions within this questionnaire to try to weed through some of those other issues. But this is still, I would say, kind of a first step in validation. It's, it's an expensive study, but it's not, say, a full clinical in-lab study that's hooked up to monitors and monitoring data. So because of the price point of that type of study, this was a great opportunity for us to make a first step, basically validate the anecdote that was coming out. And we're now moving towards another study, actually, that will have a lot more important data, blood samples, actual monitoring of your sleep cycles, duration, et cetera, with Oregon Health and Sciences University. So we've just signed an LOI for that and are really excited about moving that forward. And it's actually going to be on dementia patients and the caregivers for those, which is really exciting. Neurodegenerative diseases, sleep issues are one of the biggest side effects of that disease that ends up compounding those diseases. And so they don't really love using melatonin for those hormone reasons. And obviously things like Ambien have serious side effects that combined with dementia could be, quite difficult. So they were, when we brought this to them and showed them what we were working on, they were really excited to have something potentially. And so we're preparing that study with OHSU right now.
I have a quick question. What was the dosage for melatonin?
5 milligrams.
And did you guys do other melatonin dosage as well during the study? Or is that kind of the accepted melatonin dose?
Yeah, that's the standard okay. Dose for melatonin. I think there's maybe products that have more than that, but it's, it's not recommended to take more than that, I think, Makes generally. Sense. So, Makes sense. We just, again, each arm is expensive in the study. And so
what does an arm mean?
An arm is essentially a specific offer or formulation. So in our case, we had the placebo is an arm, and then the 3 different dosages of melatonin, and then of CBN, and then the dosage of melatonin. So it was a 5-arm study.
How long does that kind of a study take? Is that something where you guys plan for a year and then it's a month? How does that whole thing work?
So from start to the study itself is a 30-day study. So that piece is, fixed. But it was
they take it every day for 30 days, correct?
Yeah, 30 days. And they report every day within that or within every sequence of days. But there was probably, 3 months leading into it to think about what the dosage would be, preparing, what the ingestible form was going to be. And in this case, we did a gel cap just to make it as simple as possible. Our interest was purely in the CBN itself and not, so there's no other compounds here. It wasn't a mixture. There's not, bioavailability increases. We wanted a fundamental baseline on CBN's effects. And so making that product, getting those, and we had some delays because UPS lost half of the package, half of the product when we shipped it out to go get delivered. And so we had to go back and remake all of that product and reship it out.
Only in cannabis.
Yeah, exactly. That mistake at least, allowed us to add the 100 milligram arm, which was like a last minute kind of addition to say, hey, we have some folks out there that are saying they're using 100, and let's just toss it in to kind of see. And obviously we got that, really important piece of data that you don't need that much. So, really happy we got that chance to add it. Post that, obviously there's the review of all the data. They have to run all the statistics and then write the manuscript for it. So all together is probably 6-7 months before we got to the point where we had a finished manuscript. And then you start searching for a journal to publish that. And that basically, that process of peer review is there's scientific journals out there. You submit to them, they send it to their reviewers who are, scientists within whatever field. And they basically sign off that this meets scientific rigor and can therefore be published by the journal. And so, like I said, we're hoping right now that we're all on track, and we're looking at a publication August 25th.
Amazing. So just to put it in perspective to make sure that I understand correctly, is like you have a hunch CBN could be beneficial. And here are the 5 different ranges we're doing. When the data comes back based on that, do you do a secondary double-blind study in order to, based on the information that came back, you knew it's condensed down into different ranges? Do you do it again in order to try to grow on the pyramid to really pinpoint the most beneficial? Or is there a certain leg of it where you're like, okay, like this is where we are?
I mean, for this one, we got a good result. So there's, a claim here, a legitimate efficacy claim, like say clinically validated for improving sleep quality, improved sleep quality, improved sleep duration. There's a handful of claims that are valid. We even sent this whole manuscript over to a regulatory legal firm and said, hey, can you give us a memo? Because of course this is the cannabis industry, and you gotta double check everybody, even ourselves. And so then they drafted up a memo basically saying, here are valid claims that this study allows you to make. And so we've really tried to, do all the things that legitimize this work, especially coming from an industry that doesn't have a lot of legitimacy and stigma too. It's like, we've got a lot more to overcome than other things, right? So like, there's still a ton of stigma out there, and I run into it all the time around everything, but there's also a ton of excitement, which is really cool. And people are really, particularly the scientific community, the practitioners, the doctors, they've been really positively responding to this and excited for these outcomes, because it gives just another tool to deal with sleep issues.
And so now that you can successfully make claims, does that open the doors for like a Costco, or is there other kind of steps now that need to be taken? Like, what's that path look like?
Just the 3 of us.
Yeah,
yeah, we won't know.
The biggest step here, and call it 8 times more expensive, almost $1 million in studies, is just general toxicology work. So basically saying, is this product safe at the dosages that we're talking about? And in excess, it has to be safe up to, a significant amount higher than the dosage that you're looking to recommend. So there's basically a list, I think it's of about 7 studies that are the baseline for a dietary ingredient filing, or what's called a generally regarded as safe, which is a food designation that, I can't remember, I get the year wrong here, but somewhere in the 80s, I want to say, or early 90s, they basically created a rule system that says you have to have one of these standards, particularly dietary ingredient, if you want to be considered a dietary ingredient, or if you want to be a food ingredient. They are the same studies. They grandfathered things before that were already being consumed, and anything going forward has to complete those. And in the case of cannabinoids, they were consumed, but not legally. So unfortunately, they don't meet that grandfathered status and have to go through this process. Post completion of this, there's a few different routes for it. But the dietary ingredient is you prepare all the science that went into it, and you submit it to the FDA, and they give you a sign off, basically, that this is now a dietary ingredient. So that's the big one that retailers, would want to see to make sure they're not taking risk on selling something that's not approved for human consumption, or the companies like Kirkland Signature, these big brands, why they haven't adopted cannabinoids, because a lot of them had interest in CBD when it when the hemp bill came out, and they all kind of circled around the industry. And then the whole music stopped on that when this became apparent that CBD had this regulatory issue around Epidiolex already being approved as a drug and can't go backwards now. There is an effort to change that, but it's been ongoing now for years. So yeah, that's the big piece. But obviously, something approved for human consumption that has no efficacy validated for it. So you kind of need both, in our view, to really get out there. Otherwise, you're just selling something that is potentially snake oil.
Did you have any assumptions going into the study thinking that I believe X and then Y happened? Or was there anything that surprised you when you looked at the data after the study and said, I didn't think that would be what happened?
I mean, I'm always a skeptic in general. And so, especially after seeing just the amount of claims being made for cannabinoids in general, it's like they do everything. Right. And so that was kind of the mentality and the mindset out there. And, I kind of took the position as, they don't do anything until we prove it. And so it was a risk, right? CBN was already selling as a sleep aid in dispensaries. And if we ran this study and it came back and said, no, it doesn't work any better than placebo, potentially we would have just killed the entire story all at once. So that was a little feeling in the gut of like, I wonder what's going to happen here. Is this the end of the CBN craze that we've just started with this study, or is it the beginning? And it turns out to be the beginning.
That would have been quite the turning point.
Yeah, no, I wasn't actually the original CEO of this company. So I did, help bring it together in the beginning. But I was asked to take over just about 2.5 years ago now. And the company was just making CBN. It had a small cohort of clients at the time. We were no longer, I would say, the leader. We started it, but there were a couple other companies that had started manufacturing CBN at that point, and we weren't, competing well. So when I took over, not only was it, let's go build a better reputation here and get more aggressive and focus on building really strong customer relationships within the cannabis space, as we had with Gruen and Wild, for example. But, how are we going to advance this? And so I kind of looked at it as a Hail Mary throw. We tossed that ball down the field, and we've caught it now at the 95-yard line or so with the sleep study and the we're going to finish tox in 1 week. So we've finished everything up. The final study that's left will be done in a week. Everything looks perfect. And we're on track to get that dietary grain filing, we think, by the end of this year. So we're going to run to this N-yard line, and we're going to start trying to bring CBN out into compete with traditional sleep aids in traditional channels and spaces where they show up.
Yeah, so let's talk about that strategy, because that's pretty interesting, right? You're going to take an approach to compete with sleeping products currently, but at the same time, you can go back to the cannabis industry and say, hey, you can continue to try to sell your CBN products with made-up information, or you can use our ingredients, which have been validated by science, as a big differentiator, because like you said, Gruen and maybe Wild are using it, but the others are just maybe making up information or just kind of using, but I don't know how you want to describe that in order to be accurate. But is that a conversation USP piece when you go back to them and say, hey, like your team should consider utilizing our ingredients in your products?
Well, so I mean, I will kind of give a little, piece here that the THC with CBN product, I think, is a different product completely. And that it is, 10 milligrams is generally the maximum amount of CBN you'd see in an edible product. But I would say the anecdote or kind of feedback and personal feeling here is that CBN combined with THC really creates a repeatable and highly desirable effect, high effect. It modulates the way THC feels and makes it more of a body high, more relaxing, more kind of melty feel. So I think that's an incredible product in the market for the consumers that are looking to get high. They do sleep better because of that, because it's super relaxing. So for those who want to get high, maybe you don't need 50 milligrams combined with your THC to get that effect. That 50 milligrams is really for those who don't want any psychoactive effect within it. So I love that product. I think it's great. The one-to-ones or, little combinations of cannabinoids with CBN, and the effects seem to be incredible for people. Real vibe on those products. But beyond that, yes, there's the ability to say, hey, there's another customer that either wants even lower THC and is really focused. I mean, again, a lot of that's people are buying for sleep, but they're walking in dispensaries and saying, hey, I need help sleeping. I'm looking at cannabis. I've heard there's, some potential here that this could help me. And I don't really want to get high. Right. And so I think that's where this could start to shift. Rune actually is the first company now to launch a true CBN active ingredient product within the dispensary range. It's just going to market right now. It's 2.5 milligrams of THC with 25 milligrams of CBN. And so that could be an incredible product. I'm, still waiting to kind of hear the feedback on it, but it's got, enough of the CBN dose that it would be considered a clinically validated claim for improving sleep quality. And it's got just a little touch of THC in there that could end up making that, just that perfect kind of intro cannabis product for those who are going to dispensaries. So excited to see results on that. And again, that's, just innovation here around, what are new products and how do we approach them?
So is that the kind of gating aspect for a brand to be able to include on their packaging that it has a nutraceutically approved ingredient, is that they have to be utilizing the true CBN that you guys manufacture, right? That has the purity profile at the doses that were conducted in the studies, right? Is that kind of what had the checklist, if you will?
Yeah, definitely. To make the claims, it has to be our CBN. It needs to be called True CBN because the study was run on the trademark name. And it says, this is a proprietary, CBN ingredient manufactured under specific controls, essentially. Obviously, the cannabis industry doesn't really care or need dietary ingredient filing because the cannabis industry operates, the FDA doesn't oversee cannabis at the state level, right? So it's just a different market. The hemp CBD product market, that one is just floating in that gray zone where it's not really approved for human consumption, but certainly in the dispensaries, a dietary ingredient is not what they're looking for. But to make the claims and be able to say, hey, especially in the marketing side, right? Consumers are coming in and it's like, yeah, they're getting a product recommended, but for a company to say, hey, look, this is a true CBN product. It says on the front here, and you can go read this study. It's, published in a legitimate scientific journal and it's getting attention of maybe doctors and things. So that I think is big in terms of building that consumer trust and confidence to kind of go beyond where we are today in the market.
Any considerations to do the THC and CBN pairing? And from a secondary question, like how significant of an accomplishment is this? And are there surprises on some of the scientists, maybe outside industry, when you tell them like what you've accomplished?
We can't study THC today, actually.
Why not?
Because it's a Schedule I drug. So there's significant barriers. You'd have to have a DEA license. It's a lot more complicated. So we're barred from really stepping into that zone. I would love to be able to do that, and certainly think that there could be some great effects there. Again, even light doses of THC that could give people just a better feeling overall. Maybe
if we move to Schedule III, does that make it easier to allow that?
I think Schedule III is going to be an interesting and complicated thing to analyze here. And again, we're adding regulations on top of complicated regulations that already exist that don't reconcile each other. And then you've got, a bunch of different stuff happening at state levels that are conflicting with certain things. So I think there's a lot to still analyze and understand about what Schedule III means specifically from a research perspective. Could we research, THC alone? Is it looking at, more of what we've seen in the medical cannabis, kind of state rollouts where you just go to a special doctor that basically says you can now smoke weed, basically, and gives you a medical card? Maybe it looks a little bit like that. There's not really a lot of, history here around trying to study a complex mixture. So like studying cannabis either as a broad spectrum extract or flower, that's really complicated. The FDA doesn't have a framework for that. And, you'd have to have rigorous manufacturing controls that formulation was literally identical every single time. You couldn't just, even grow a strain that's like it's the same strain each time. There's too much variable even in that. So it definitely has some big impact on the industry as a whole, particularly, removing 280E which doesn't affect us, but certainly from a cannabis industry perspective, it removes that. I think it definitely goes a long way to reduce stigma continually here as it gets more acceptable. But I think it's still complicated. I would even say outside of Delta-9 THC specifically, and you could make the argument that Delta-9 derived from hemp is a hemp derivative, as many are, and therefore you could handle it outside of the Schedule 1 or Schedule 3 situation. But outside of that, all cannabinoids besides CBD, you could just follow the standard FDA protocols, whether you wanted to go through what they call an investigative new drug filing and approach the FDA to create a drug like Epidiolex or CBD in that case, or whether you wanted to do a food ingredient additive or a dietary ingredient. That's all laid out, and no one has ever said you can't do this as a cannabinoid. It's just that the first two cannabinoids that were the big stories, THC and CBD, have their own interesting regulatory issues. And we're just getting to the emergence of, minor cannabinoids, rare cannabinoids here. One of the things here is the cannabinoids definitely do not do the same thing. They all work differently in the body. They bond to CB1 and CB2 receptors differently. They all interact with a bunch of other receptors in the body differently. We've got two other kind of programs running right now where we've been screening cannabinoids, one for a neuroprotective effect and one for the ability to kill cancer cells. Those projects are with the Salk Institute and the other one's with National Cancer Institute. But in those screenings where we've got about 40 different compounds that have gone in, and this ranges from CBD, CBG, CBC, some of the more known stuff, into more obscure things, CBN, derivatives of that. Some of these do these things really well, and some don't do it at all. And so huge variances in there. So there's just a lot to really dig in and screen these things and understand, what does what. And then when you have a foundation of individual compounds, I think we can start to explore how do these things interact when you put two or three, or kind of moving towards this concept of entourage effect, which I generally view as just an excuse for not knowing what's important in the mixture.
Is there a risk of potentially conducting a study with THC as a class 3 drug, and then creating the same situation you just described that was created with Epidiolex, where you have a drug law that now is preventing these other regulations from kind of being pushed forward? Is that a potential risk?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I hadn't quite thought about that as another kind of complexity to the whole situation.
Cannabis, right?
I think the big thing here is that, THC as an intoxicant would never be approved as a dietary ingredient or a food ingredient, right?
Yeah,
it would never, because we have to do studies on CBN that basically show it doesn't have, psychoactive effects in some regards, right? It's not going to cause those things, because those can't be sold as dietary ingredient, food ingredients. I mean, even a food ingredient like a grass, I mean, it needs to be able to add to cereal that kids are going to eat, for example, right? So it's never going to meet that standard. And really, from a recreational standpoint, we just need a framework like alcohol, right? That's the way that cannabis should operate. It needs to be, taxed in a similar way so that it's not prohibitory for the industry to function right, which I think is not always the case right now, especially if the feds want to add more taxes on top of what the state taxes already are. It's heavily cumbersome, and it's going to continue to cause the black market to thrive here and exist. And then obviously with the hemp derivative side, now there's the Delta-8s and basically any THC derivative that has now been pulled out of hemp and being sold as a hemp product. People don't want Delta-8. I mean, maybe there's some interesting components to it that could make it a good compound from just how does it make you feel, just like CBN, right? But people want weed, and they're using what they have available to them at a reasonable price point. And so we've created essentially, a gray area that isn't good for consumers. It's not good for safety, and it's not following any particular rules. Now, I'm not a prohibitionist. I think every single bit of access we can increase and move towards is better. But I think there's a massive failure right now at the political level where it's mostly pandering and looking for votes, and really no actual action, and certainly no thoughtfulness about how complex and how bad it's gotten. I think back to 12 years ago when I started. And, I remember the moment I was sitting in my office, attic, whatever, and was like, this industry is going to go. Oregon was going to put it on for vote, or maybe they just had legalized. They hadn't built the framework yet. And I said, I'm going to put my 10,000 hours into this industry. And I'm going to understand the business of it. And man, was I wrong about the trajectory of how it would go, and how lack of a straight line we'd have getting to, a functioning, mature industry that's good for everybody. And we're just pinging all over. And honestly, I think it's just more chaotic and worse off than it was almost, just because there's no straight line here. But yeah, we need a good framework for recreational cannabis. And we need a good framework, which maybe Schedule 3 does, for THC specifically as a potential therapeutic, allowing you to study it. It needs to be prescribed. So that could solve really well for THC specifically as a therapeutic in research, and then prescriptions and being recommended by doctors. All other, or I guess that would include all intoxicating cannabinoids. And then all the other ones could either be drugs like CBD, but ideally there's more available access like we see with nutraceuticals and supplements. And there is a framework for that already exists. So really people just need to get out of the way of the rules and put a couple things in place. And I think we would move pretty quickly towards a real stable market where this just works a lot better than it is today.
What does the scientific community, maybe outside the cannabis industry, and then maybe just for context, the cannabis industry, what do they think when hear are they surprised to hear that there's a validated double-blind placebo-controlled study from cannabinoid therapies?
In some cases, yeah, definitely. Like the doctor at OHSU, they were blown away, especially at the size of the study, right? Like, that it had as many people in it. Super excited. I go to a bunch of different biotech conferences, healthcare conferences. I actually just came from, it's called Sleep. Just literally, it's the conference for sleep called Sleep. And, it's all doctors, practitioners, and researchers presenting the science around sleep and treatments and things. So I would say they're generally a really curious approach and some level of excitement around it. You obviously run into the folks that are just like, what, cannabis is a drug, and get out of here with that. But that's just a lack of, understanding here and the stigma showing up. But I would say more and more, there's a lot more acceptance. Even I was on a stage in a panel at South by Southwest earlier this year, and it was a really phenomenal panel. We had a doctor on there, a PhD, actually our chief science officer, PhD biochemist on stage with us, who is actually an MIT biochemist and then did cannabinoid receptor work at Scripps up to 2010. So some really foundational and meaningful work as we've been understanding cannabinoid receptors as a whole here. So we're making great progress. There's still a race to be run here, though.
I think the most important part is it's like a significant milestone for the industry that doesn't really have a ton of legitimacy. And the fact that your team is willing to push the envelope and say, okay, like, maybe it's not, or maybe it is. And what we found is that there is some sort of science behind CBN and some of its therapeutic benefits.
Yeah, no, Epidiolex was really the first big thing, and it was, approved as a drug there. So that was a great milestone in general. It's pretty uncommon, it seems, to get funding for a compound you can't own a patent on, which is something I've run into a lot around, some of the derivatives that we've screened that have some good efficacy around neuroprotection. There's one compound that we found better than CBN for this. CBN had a great effect, but either CBN or that compound, both of them are known compounds. They exist out there already, and therefore you can't patent the compound themselves. We have filed patents around the usage of those for treating these diseases, but really difficult to find funding that will fund that from a biotech perspective. Maybe that's part of the times right now is, biotech is, we're in a risk-off environment almost economically. So you're seeing a lot less flowing of capital into certainly the cannabis sector. I think there's less capital flowing into biotech and kind of early stage work there, which is probably the real reason here that it's harder to fund those. But what they really are looking for, and what we are trying to do beyond this is say, how do these things work? Why is CBN better at neuroprotection than all these other cannabinoids we looked at? What are the mechanisms that it's acting on in the body, in the brain, particularly in this case, to have this neuroprotective effect? And then can we use the mechanisms at play to then design and predict new structure compounds? So basically inspired by cannabinoids, I guess you could say almost in this case, which we could own patents for. So I think that's really where pharma gets disrupted and new drugs get developed around cannabinoids and what that work, with the work that's required to really bring that into the pharma space. I think that the interesting thing here is, one, there's clearly, the anecdote of all sorts of different effects that cannabinoids could have, meaningful impact on. If you can create a compound that will do that even better, very specifically, they're still generally super safe compounds. And they also have the ability to pass the blood-brain barrier, where most things can't do that without causing damage. So they're unique in certain ways. And I think they could have a big impact in both nutraceutical supplements, but also in the drug pharmaceutical landscape.
Are there any other cannabinoids on your radar that are really piquing interest, and one that you think is something that we're really going to look forward to in the future and say this one could be very disruptive as well?
So we're not doing this work right now, but as I have definitely tried to think about what's the next CBN from a dietary supplement ingredient side, because we're really focused on the neuroprotective stuff and trying to advance that into new compounds. But THCV, if the idea or again, there's not really much out there to support this today, but if it was an appetite suppressant, because the CB1 receptors or receptor system does modulate appetite up and down, if you could create either THCV could modulate appetite down, it could be an incredible dietary ingredient for weight loss, for an example. So, again, it's just trying to take little pieces and say, where is the potential sparkle in the sand, and go after those things. There are drugs that are targeted for obesity and diabetes right now that are specifically targeting CB1 receptors as an inverse antagonist, they call it, but basically blocking the receptor system to reduce appetite.
Ozempic?
That's a different receptor. GLP-1, they call that. So that's in the category here, but it's a different thing. Obviously very popular, but this is a different approach essentially, but similar concept and outcome. Is that it's going to reduce appetite because you're modulating CB1 receptor to block it. Now, the ones in the past here, they're blocking your CB1 receptor, so it's responsible for other things that are very important, like mood and behavior. It actually caused suicidal thoughts, the first wave of that drug. I think they're trying to modify that, but in our view, instead of blocking it, at least in how I would conceptualize this, instead of blocking it and having the damage of not having it be able to function for all these other things, can you stimulate it the way cannabinoids do to have it exhibit a particular outcome, in this case, appetite suppressant, or, we're still trying to understand the mechanism for sleep here too, now that we know that there's an effect there. So that, again, it might not even be CB1 or CB2 receptors. I want to say, and this isn't the exact number, but CBD hits like 20 different receptors when it runs around the body. They call it's a promiscuous molecule. And cannabinoids generally are relatively promiscuous in the body. They're hitting other stuff. So, this story stuck with me, and I think it's really interesting. But it was some research out of Israel around some kids that had pretty serious behavioral issues. I can't remember exactly whether it was autism or something else there, but they started treating them with a 20-to-1 ratio extract from a plant. So a broad spectrum extract, high CBD, super effective, life-changing for these children, but they lost the strain and they replaced it with a different 20-to-1 ratio strain, and it didn't work. And so, it's like, well, what was it that was responsible? And is it that there was, some minor aspect of other cannabinoids that either disrupted the effect of the CBD or disrupted the effect of the THC, or maybe it was something else in there that was core responsible? So again, it's complicated when you have these entourage compounds, and we've got a lot of work to do. But we also use artificial intelligence now, machine learning platforms, and that can really speed up this up. And there is enough data around cannabinoids that say, these ones have been tested, and these are interactions that are there, and that allows you to then predict other interactions, and then predict, the interactions of compounds that you maybe don't know yet. So. Really exciting time. This would have been, just projecting out of the future, it would have been really hard without those tools to really get to the endpoint here where we maybe fully map the cannabinoid receptor system. We fully understand cannabinoids. And that work, goes a long way to say, hey, this strain is energetic, or this strain is maybe creative, or a lot of these, function claims that people are putting on their product, this one's blue and this one's green, and, one's for energy. All that is just, today kind of a bunch of bullshit. But, there's a possibility of validating that, I think, as we progress here.
I think that is the perfect way to end it, because it's just endless kind of rabbit holes, and what your team is doing is really significant. So, Alleh, for those who are listening, they want to get in touch, they want to learn more about the studies you're doing, where can they find you?
So our website, FloraWorks with a hyphen, so flora-works.com, can come to that site there. And then we also have the gel caps from the sleep study on cbnforsleep.com. So those can be tried there for anyone that wants to. Yeah. And reach out to the website if there's any curiosity, and happy to talk. And if you're a researcher that wants to work with us, we're actively always looking for academics, researchers, and we will provide the cannabinoids and to help kind of advance this.
I love it. So we'll link it up with the show notes. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.